Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Jane Brewer, and I am the Education Specialist with United Against Human Trafficking. I'm going to wait about another minute or two. Right now, we have 4 people in the webinar here, so I'm going to wait just a little bit. But I do want to thank you all for attending and getting in here early and being here to learn about human trafficking. So if you want to take a quick stretch or get a cup of water, we will get started here in just a minute. Okay, so it is 5 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So hopefully people are just a little bit late and they will join us later. But let's get started. So again, my name is Sarah Jane Brewer, and I am the Education Specialist with United Against Human Trafficking. And I see that somebody already submitted a question. No problem, Maggie. Right now we only have 4, so at the end of the presentation, if there are more participants, I will let you know. So if at any time during this presentation you have a question come up, feel free to submit it in your question pane, and I will give you, or I will have some time at the answers to I'll have some time at the end to answer all the questions. Sorry about that. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So a little bit about my organization, United Against Human Trafficking. So my department is the education department, and we give presentations about human trafficking to people in the community and to frontline professionals that have the highest likelihood of coming into contact with victims and survivors of trafficking. Those frontline professionals include social service providers, healthcare providers, law enforcement, those in hospitality, and educators. So we have specialized trainings for those groups. We also lead a coalition of social service providers, and we're going to talk about that coalition a little bit more later. So we also try to prevent exploitation before it happens, and we do that by reaching out to youth in high school and middle schools and juvenile detention centers to talk to them not only about what human trafficking is, but also about the recruitment methods, how they can stay safe online using social media. And especially for more vulnerable youth, such as ones that are in juvenile detention facilities or in foster care, we also talk to them about how they can build skills to be more resilient. And we also work with survivors directly. So we have a support group for survivors and their families to help them unpack their experiences and learn coping skills. We're also moving into case management in the near future. So that's just a little bit about what we do. So I want to, actually, I'm going to skip this video in the interest of time, but this video is by the Blue campaign, and it just shows that we can really, trafficking is happening all around us, and even in our favorite restaurants, on our street, and it's important for us to know what to look for and what to do, and that is what we are going to learn during this presentation. Come on. There we go. Okay. So at its core, human trafficking is a business, right? It's driven by this demand for labor and for commercial sex. It is the second largest criminal industry in the world after the drug trade. However, it is the fastest growing criminal industry. And the reason for that is if somebody Drugs, they are manufactured, they're sold, they're used one time. But a human being, unfortunately, can be used over and over again until they either leave their situation or they die, unfortunately. So at its core, human trafficking is really a human rights violation. Each of us as people have a right to be free and to pursue what we want to pursue. And I see that somebody has their hand up. So what I'm going to ask is if you have a question, please submit your question in the question pane and at any time, and I will get to them at the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what human trafficking is. What is the definition? So human trafficking was really clearly defined here in the United States with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was enacted in 2000, which is not that long ago. So this is really a relatively new movement in comparison with other social justice movements. So essentially, the TVPA really gave us a clear definition as well as a way of prosecuting traffickers and protecting and providing services for victims. So human trafficking is defined as an action by a means for a purpose. So the action is the recruiting, the harboring, transporting, obtaining. Every few years, the act is reauthorized and made more clear in line with the evolving nature of this crime. So, for example, as so much of our society has moved online, especially in the last month or so, human trafficking has moved online as well. And we've seen in recent years a huge increase in advertising for sex trafficking online. And so they added the advertising and the soliciting in the last authorization of the TVPA. And when we say means, we are referring to a means of control. So force can be sexual assault, physical assault, isolation, starvation, forced drug use, bondage, being in chains or being in a cage. And to be honest, this is not what we see most of the time in terms of establishing a means of control. You know, traffickers are in this for the long run, and it's easier to manipulate your victim because if you force them, then they're always going to try to escape. But if you can manipulate them into believing that this is a situation that they want to be in, then you'll be able to use them for a longer period of time. But force is really what most people think about in human trafficking, right? We hear human trafficking and we think of somebody getting snatched off the street in a white van and kidnapped, and that's just not what we are seeing most of the time. So what we see more frequently are fraud and coercion. So fraud looks like a false romantic promise. It can be, you know, someone is dating their victim. They're buying them gifts, they're complimenting them, making them feel loved, making them believe that they are in a relationship. And once that love and trust is established with their victim, then they turn around and say, well, I need you to do this, you know, just we need to make the rent, or I need you to do this for our future. And fraud can also look like a false job offer. So a job that either does not exist or is very different from what was initially promised. And coercion is essentially this for that, right? If you don't do this, then I'm going to do this. And it can look like threats to the person's parents, children, siblings, friends, loved ones. It can look like blackmail. You know, a lot of young people are unfortunately taking inappropriate pictures or videos and sending them to people that they think they can trust. And traffickers can get their hands on those materials and then say, if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to send this to your whole school. I'm going to show your parents. And for a young person, that can be a really crippling thing. It can be a crippling thing for an adult too in a professional environment. And it can look like the taking of IDs. So what we see really frequently, especially in terms of foreign national victims, is, somebody is approached by a recruiter in their home country who tells them, I have a great job for you waiting in the United States. You'll earn a lot of money. You'll be able to earn a great wage and send money home to your family. We'll take care of everything, your visa, your paperwork, all of that. But there's a recruitment fee. So the person pays this recruitment fee, gets flown over to the United States, ends up working a job that's usually very different from what was promised, which is the fraud element. But then the trafficker or recruiter turns around and says, well, now you owe me for transportation and for your visa and for this and for that. And I'm also taking a hold of your documents. And if you tell anybody, I will hurt your family and you can't go to the police because they'll deport you. And I know that sounds like a lot of different elements, but in cases of labor trafficking with foreign national victims, those are the elements that we see. So victims are held in captivity through psychological bonds because they believe they have this debt to pay off. They have no means of making money otherwise in the United States, and it's likely that the trafficker threatened the safety of their family, and they don't see themselves as a victim necessarily who is deserving of rights. They just think that this is a decision that they made, and now they have to be in this situation until they pay off their debt. Although, of course, that debt is never paid off. So that system of a trafficker incurring a debt that can't ever be paid off is known as debt bondage or peonage, and we see this really frequently with labor trafficking. So an action by a means for the purpose of sexual exploitation or labor exploitation. So sexual exploitation is a commercial sex act. So this is sex or a sexual act, which can include a pornography or webcamming, in exchange for something of value. And value does not have to mean money. Value can mean a safe place to sleep, transportation, safety, food, drugs, anything that a victim deems valuable in that moment. Now, labor exploitation is a little bit more difficult for us to identify because it could just look like somebody working. And it's hard for people to identify that when they're in that situation because it really depends on individuals knowing their own labor rights. And labor rights are not something that we are inherently taught in the United States. And for somebody coming from another country, labor exploitation and labor rights could look very different from where they are from. But labor exploitation does not necessarily mean that the victim is not getting paid. It can mean that they are working too many hours, they are not earning enough money for the work that they are doing, they are being physically or sexually assaulted on the job. Any of those labor exploitation elements. So I want to point out a few things about this definition. Nowhere in here do we see money. Money does not have to change hands for trafficking to occur. Sometimes victims of human trafficking are in fact paid, but that does not negate their status as a victim of trafficking. Another word that we do not see in this definition is consent. So people can consent to their own exploitation, and that does not mean that they are not a victim of human trafficking. So the exception to this rule is if somebody is under the age of 18, we do not need to prove force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of sexual exploitation. And the reason for this is that the federal age of consent is 18, so somebody under 18 cannot consent to a commercial sexual act. So if any of these actions are present, including the soliciting, which is pretty broad, then that child is automatically a victim of sexual exploitation. So I know that I really went into depth in this slide, but I wanted to be really clear about the definition of human trafficking. So if you have any questions about the definition, please submit them in your question box. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move forward. So I want to talk about statistics, but before I do, this is largely a hidden crime, and it's really difficult to get, sorry, my PowerPoint was jumping ahead. It's difficult to get statistics about this crime because by its nature, it is hidden. Traffickers are constantly thinking of new ways to stay in the shadows. That being said, the study was done by the International Labor Organization in 2017 using really reliable methods and methodologies. And what they found is that there are about 24.9 million victims of human trafficking globally. That number jumps to 40 million if we include forced marriages. And to break it down by gender, we see about 55% women and 45% men. In terms of age, it's 74% adults and 26% children. And this can be really surprising because when we hear about trafficking, we really only hear about it affecting women and children. We really have women, women and children in our minds as being more vulnerable to being exploited. But in the data, that's not necessarily what we are seeing. So to bring it closer to home here in Texas, a study done by the University of Texas at Austin found that there are about 313,000 victims in Texas alone. Texas is actually known as the state with the second most reported cases of human trafficking, California being the first. And they found that there are about 79,000 victims of minor sex trafficking and 234,000 victims of labor trafficking. And full disclosure, they were not able to obtain reliable data about adult victims of sex trafficking. So we are already missing a huge part of the puzzle. But even without that population, we still have about 313,000 victims, and that is a huge number. So why is Texas such a hub for human trafficking? And I should also add that Houston has the #1 reported cases of human trafficking in terms of a city. So there are a few different reasons that Houston can be considered a hub for human trafficking. We are close to the border with Mexico. We have a lot of transit systems, airports, seaports, roadways. The Department of Justice determined that the I-10, which stretches from California to Texas, is the most frequently used road by human traffickers. We also have a really diverse labor sector, and especially our huge industries such as oil and gas, fishing, agriculture, and construction. Those are really huge industries that rely on a lot of labor and are removed from the public eye. So those are areas that it's easier for labor trafficking to thrive. We also have a really diverse and sprawling community. Geographically, Houston, it's huge, and we have this urban city as well as a lot of rural areas. The diversity and the large immigrant populations are part of what make Houston such an amazing city. But the flip side of that is that traffickers who bring in victims that are foreign nationals, it's easier for them to hide in the shadows, because when we see people from other communities who don't speak English, who maybe look nervous or paranoid or anything like that, we wouldn't think twice about it. So the flip side of that is that Houston also has a really built out anti-trafficking network, the most built out anti-trafficking network in a single city that I know of. So we have a three-pronged approach to fighting human trafficking. We have the Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance, which is law enforcement, prosecutors, social service agencies at the local, state, and federal level that are all working towards better practices in investigation into trafficking cases and the prosecution of traffickers. And then we also have the special advisor to the mayor, and this was a position created, it was a brand new position when Houston started it, and it has since been replicated in other cities. But the role of the special advisor to the mayor is to really institutionalize and coordinate the city of Houston's efforts to fight human trafficking. Just recently, the city passed an ordinance that all hotels and motels within the city must receive human trafficking training. So that's just one of the initiatives spearheaded by the city of Houston. Other initiatives include public outreach campaigns. So if you've seen those billboards around town that say, "Can you see me?" and have the human trafficking hotline number, that was an initiative of this office. She also instituted identification posters in jails and examining procurement practices to ensure against labor trafficking. So in addition, we also have the Houston Rescue and Restore Coalition, and this is the coalition that my organization, United Against Human Trafficking, leads, which I mentioned in the beginning. So the Houston Rescue and Restore Coalition is made up of about 65 to 70 organizations, social service providers that are all dedicated to fighting human trafficking here in the city of Houston. So they provide a range of services from prevention, education, and awareness to providing direct services to survivors of trafficking and everything in between. So the purpose of the coalition is really to bring everybody together to learn from each other, collaborate, share best practices, and share resources. Okay, so really quickly, I want to talk about some of the crimes that are confused with human trafficking. And I won't go into each one, but essentially, any of these can be present in a trafficking situation, but the presence of these crimes does not necessarily mean that it is human trafficking. So I do want to differentiate between human smuggling and prostitution and human trafficking. So human smuggling means it's when somebody pays for a transportation service over state lines. So the service that is being bought and sold is transportation, and the crime is against a state border. Even though the term trafficking implies movement, trafficking does not, or movement does not have to take place in order for it to be a trafficking situation. What we have seen is that maybe there is a smuggling situation, and due to the vulnerable position that somebody is in, if they are smuggled into a country and they have a legal status, they are more vulnerable to trafficking. But smuggling and trafficking are not the same thing. Now, prostitution. So what's the difference between prostitution and sex trafficking? Essentially, prostitution only involves two parties, the buyer of sex and the seller of sex, and it is completely consensual between the two parties. When there is a third party involved, the trafficker, who is mitigating the transaction, taking the money, choosing the clients, forcing the provider of sex in any way during the transaction, then that person is a sex trafficker or a pimp. It is the same thing. So if two parties are involved, it is prostitution. If there are three parties involved, then it is sex trafficking. And I'm not going to go into each of these other crimes, but if you have any question about this slide, please do submit your question in the question pane. Okay, so where does trafficking happen? The short answer is that trafficking can really happen anywhere, in people's individuals' homes, to big companies. But there are some industries that we see trafficking happen more frequently. So as far as labor trafficking goes, we can see it at any of these locations. The three most common labor trafficking places identified by Polaris Project were in construction, domestic servitude, and traveling sales crews. And sometimes people are a little bit surprised by traveling sales crews, but this is actually, unfortunately, a really frequent practice where, traveling sales crews advertise on sites like Craigslist or Facebook and say, hey, if you want to earn a ton of money and travel the country, they sort of promote this party culture. Join us in this traveling sales crew and sell magazines or cosmetics or whatever the case may be. And then once the person is involved, there are a lot of exploitative practices within that. Some of the stories we've heard include physical and sexual assault, bullying, when traveling sales crews go to hotels, if somebody doesn't meet their quota, they're not allowed to stay in the hotel. They'll have to sleep outside, a lot of different exploitative practices. So if somebody does come to your door trying to sell something, maybe ask them a few questions. Ask them, if they're safe. And we'll talk a little bit more about asking questions and the hotline later in the presentation. With respect to sex trafficking, it can occur in private homes and places where there is a lot of transportation. So truck stops, large events, train stations, places like that, and over the internet. And we have found that cantinas can often be a front for brothels. So essentially any place where there is a lot of transportation, a lot of people coming and going, people are in town for an event, things like that, we see a higher concentration of sex trafficking. Now, there are some instances where sex trafficking and labor trafficking can happen in the same place, such as nail salons, hotels, massage parlors, strip clubs. So in this case, there can be elements of labor trafficking as well as sex trafficking. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this slide, but essentially, who do we think of when we think of traffickers or victims or buyers? We might think of the victims as women and children and the traffickers as, older white men or businessmen. But all of the people on this slide are actually convicted human traffickers. Trafficking can happen to anybody and by anybody. So really quickly, I want to go over each of the stories. So on the top left, the African-American woman, her name is Antoinette Davis, and she trafficked her 5-year-old daughter to pay off a $500 drug debt. And this was an experience that her daughter did not survive. The Hispanic person in the top middle is Gerardo Salazar, also known as El Gallo, and he would travel to Mexico to date these girls, meet their families, convince them to move to Houston with him. And once they were in Houston, he branded them with a rooster tattoo and forced them into commercial sex acts. The man next to him is Andrew Fields, and he was a drug dealer before he realized that he could use his drugs to control people. So essentially, he got these young women addicted to these really scary, heavy, addictive drugs and forced them to commit commercial sex acts and would withhold their next fix until they complied with his demands. The white man on the bottom left is Andras Voss, and he and two other men went to Hungary and recruited a few young gay men and brought them to New York. And they moved them from Miami to New York and forced them to commit sex acts around the clock. Didn't allow them to rest, didn't allow them to eat or drink. The men were severely malnourished when they were rescued from their situation. And although trafficking does imply movement, movement does not have to occur. Movement is something that traffickers use to confuse their victims. If somebody doesn't know where they are, then it is a lot more difficult for them to ask for help or trust law enforcement. So the bottom middle is the one that usually surprises people. This is Montia Parker. She was 18 years old, straight A student, captain of her cheerleader squad, and she had an older boyfriend who was trying to traffic her. And she saw these methods and turned them around on someone that she thought she could control. So she used them on her 16-year-old classmate that had a learning disability and convinced her to have sex with men and that it would be a good way to save money for college. So she advertised for her victim on Backpage.com and then pocketed the money that the girl earned. The woman on the bottom right is Hortensia Mendelez Argeo, also known as Tensha. And she operated a few successful cantinas and some other real estate in Houston, one of them off of Telephone Road. And at the time of her arrest, she was 71 years old, and her youngest victim was her 14-year-old granddaughter. So a big reason that we show this slide is to show, is to fight our prejudice against who we think traffickers may be. But also, when we look at who were these people in relationship to their victim, mother, boyfriend, drug dealer, employer, classmate, grandmother, these are people that their victims trust. These are people that their victims maybe even love. And so that just makes it much harder for them to identify as victims and to seek help, seek to get out of their situation. So Covenant House is an international nonprofit that provides emergency shelter for young people ages 18 to 24. So they have a location here in Houston, but they did this study with their clients in New York. And so this study was specifically done with female victims of sex trafficking. And they found that 36% of their clients were trafficked by immediate family members. This immediate family members means mothers or parents, grandparents, and siblings. 27% were trafficked by a boyfriend, 14% friends of family, 14% employers, and only 9% were trafficked by strangers. So when we hear stories about people getting trafficked, we hear about, zip ties being used to lure people out, or people, laying in the middle of the road to trick people. But the reality of human trafficking is that this is happening with people who already have vulnerabilities, and the people who already know them and know their vulnerabilities exploit those vulnerabilities for the purpose of labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And so when we come into these situations, even if we are just trying to help people or provide resources or an escape, we are looked at as outsiders in these situations. So how do traffickers recruit their victims? Seduction and coercion are the methods that we see the most frequently, like we saw with El Gallo and the young girls that he would recruit from Mexico. But we also see advertising for modeling jobs, acting jobs. You know, if you go on Craigslist on the missed connection section, then you can see people, or the classified section as well, people posting ads saying, hey, we are looking for girls for swimsuit modeling. And from our work with survivors, we have heard stories that that is just a front for getting them involved in sex trafficking. Peer recruitment, like we saw with Montia Parker, you know, sometimes traffickers will go into schools, well, they'll send one minor victim that they have recruited and send that person in to recruit more of their peers. There are even recruitment agencies, especially in large industries, that are looking to recruit a lot of people, such as in the hospitality industry or in the agricultural industry. These recruitment agencies will go to areas where they know people are more vulnerable and say, hey, we have a great job for you, come with us. Social media, especially with minors, you know, we, especially now in the midst of social distancing, are spending so much of our time online on social media. And when people post that they need a job or they're lonely or they want a relationship and personal details about them, traffickers can use that information to get close to them. We do see parents selling children, like the case of Antoinette Davis and her daughter. And violence and forcing kidnapping are methods that we see, but we do see these the least frequently. So I am going to skip this video again in the interest of time, but if you have some extra time, I really highly recommend that you go to thelifestory.org. That is a website that has stories that survivors tell about their experiences. And it's really eye-opening to find out all of the different ways that people who are just looking for a job or support or love are exploited. And to hear their stories is really powerful. So I highly recommend visiting lifestory.org to hear them. So in this next part of the presentation, we are going to talk about red flags and indicators. And I want to preface this by saying that I can't give you a checklist, you know, if A, B, and C are present, then this is trafficking. What this is these are common scenes and scenarios that we see in trafficking. And if you see these, they should prompt you to ask more questions. And if your intuition is telling you something is wrong, then that's when we want you to take action. So in the case of labor trafficking, if there is security intended to keep people inside rather than out, so barbed wire fence facing inwards, floodlights facing inwards, locks on the outside of doors, or an unusual amount of security cameras. You know, if you walk into a donut store and you notice that there is some kind of housing attached to it with an unusual amount of security, that's a red flag for labor trafficking. Living and working conditions. So if people live on or near the work premises and there's some indication that they cannot leave that work premises. If there is a large number of occupants living in a single space, they maybe aren't able to communicate with you as a customer or as a citizen, or if they are frequently moved. So this picture in the lower right-hand corner is from a case known as Signal International. So this happened after Hurricane Katrina. There was a company called Signal International, which they were shipbuilders who helped with repairing oil rigs after that disaster. And they hired, I think it was around 500 engineers from India, charged them this exorbitant recruitment fee. I think it was equivalent to about $20,000. And so these people, these engineers, really, scraped everything that they could from friends and from family to pay this recruitment fee. And then once they arrived in the United States, this was the living situation that they were forced into. And as you can see, sanitation is an issue, space is an issue. They were really living on top of each other. And the recruiters were charging them $1,000 a month for this living situation. So as you can imagine, this was a debt bondage situation where the traffickers told them that they had to pay off, visa fees and transportation and all of these other fees before they could leave this labor situation. So if any of these exploitative practices are present, that can be a good indicator of labor trafficking. So in terms of physical and behavioral indicators, like we saw with El Gallo, tattoos are used as a sign of branding. This is a way that traffickers signify someone as their property. So the tattoos in the past have been sort of egregious. They've been symbols of money or royalty, like crowns, money, diamonds, a coat of arms, in conjunction with a name or initials. But in recent years, traffickers have used more subtle signs like a rooster or a Superman symbol. So a good action item for this is if you see someone with a really visible tattoo, ask them where they got it. And if they try to hide it or they're nervous about it or they mention that, oh, my boyfriend wanted me to get this tattoo, that is a red flag. If you see signs of physical abuse or sexual abuse, bruises, cuts, burns, scarring, things like that. Suspicious or unexplained injury. So if somebody can't explain how they got injured, or if they said they got injured at work but can't say what they do for work. Symptoms of neglect. So people who are being trafficked are not in a position where they can take care of themselves. So things like body odor, dental neglect. It seems that they're not able to take a shower or brush their teeth or get enough water. Simple things like that are withheld from them to essentially make them weaker so that it's harder for them to fight back against the trafficker. Inconsistencies in stories. So maybe, you're asking somebody what their story is and you ask them one time and then they change it a few minutes later. So there can be a few different reasons for this. If we suspect that somebody is trafficked, then we suspect they have undergone extreme forms of trauma. And trauma manifests in different ways, but one of those is in a loss of memory. So sometimes victims will dissociate or black out during their experiences, so they might not remember or they might misremember. Additionally, it's possible that a trafficker gave them a story or a script to follow. So maybe they're mixing up what actually happened with what the trafficker told them to say. And that goes along with that restricted communication. It seems like there are certain things that they're not allowed to tell you, or there's a partner on scene who is not letting you talk to them, or they sort of look to this other person before they answer your question. If anybody works with minors, if there is a severe change in academic performance, promiscuous behavior, they're missing class, they are falling asleep in class, there seem to be those elements of neglect. Like I mentioned before, traffickers will not necessarily take their victims. They'll let them stay with their families or continue going to school so that they can use them for a longer period of time. So even though someone is still attending school, they could be being trafficked after school or being taken out of school. So say you notice any of these signs and you're wondering, okay, so I see these signs, my gut is telling me that there is something going wrong, what do I do? The best thing that you can do is call or text the human trafficking hotline. So I want everybody to put this number in their phone, 1-888-373-7888. Now, this number is run 24/7 in about 200 languages. And this is a number that you can call if you see something, number one, where it says credible tip. So provide as much actionable information as possible. Don't intervene. You can, of course, if it's safe and the trafficker isn't around and this person is able and willing to talk to you, then you might ask those questions about, where did you get that injury or where did you get that tattoo? However, if the trafficker is on site, your safety is the most important thing. So do not try to intervene or separate them, but provide actionable information. So things like an address, a name, a license plate number, address cross streets, the signs that you noticed that could indicate human trafficking, such as the controlling presence or clothing that's inappropriate for the weather or any of the other red flags that we mentioned. So call this number and they will ask questions to prompt making a report. And if there's enough actionable information to make a report, then they will funnel that through to local law enforcement that are specifically trained in fighting human trafficking. Now, this is not an emergency number. So if you are unsure, it's better to call them, because if you're wrong, it's not a big deal. However, if you're right, then you could be the reason that that person gets help. Another way that this works is you can try to safely give this number to somebody that you suspect is a victim of trafficking. Because the first thing is when somebody answers the phone from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, they will ask, are you safe? And if it is a victim of human trafficking, then they can connect them with immediate shelter and resources local to their area. So they will funnel that down to services that are here in Houston. But say you were to travel to California and you think you see human trafficking, you can still use this number and it will filter to a local organization. Now you can also call them to ask about resources. If you visit them online, they have a web chat, and they also have an amazing resource library as well as a directory of victim services. And they also have a text line, so you can text them at 233733. I just texted them last week because I saw something on my social media that I thought was really suspicious. And they took all of the information, they provided me with some guidance, and they assigned me a case number so that if something else happens, I can call them back and refer to that same case number if it has to do with the same person or observation. So please do take down this number. I do want to add that if there is a minor suspected of being trafficked, then it is mandatory to report it to the Texas Department of Family Protective Services. However, you can call the Human Trafficking Hotline in addition to that. And if anybody has to adhere to HIPAA, then you need to get the permission of your patient in order to make a report on the Human Trafficking Hotline. So really quickly, I want to talk about a case study. So this happened in about 2016, 2017, I believe. So Nsabundus went to Nigeria and recruited a woman to help them take care of their 2-year-old twins. And they said that they were going to pay her $100 a month and help her get her arm fixed. It had been injured in a motorcycle accident. And when she got to the home, which was out here in Katy, the woman worked about 20 hours a day. She had to sleep on the floor. She was beaten frequently. She was subjected to really cruel and unusual punishments. For example, she put the wrong socks on the child's feet, or the Nsabundas determined that they were the wrong socks, and they dragged her by her hair down the stairs. So this woman, the only way that she was allowed outside was twice a day to take the children around the block. And a neighbor witnessed this and thought that it was really peculiar. And so the woman traveled to Austin and saw a poster with the hotline number as well as red flags. And she noticed that this seemed to be a situation of human trafficking. So she called the hotline number, and law enforcement arrived on scene, determined that it was a trafficking situation, and the Nsabundas were arrested, and the woman was connected with help and resources. Okay, so we are nearing the end of our presentation, but if you liked this presentation and you're wondering what else you can do, maybe you have another group that would be interested in a presentation or one of the more specific presentations, such as social service providers or healthcare providers. We also have programs for youth and parents. We obviously cannot do tablings or panels because nobody is allowed to leave their house and gather anywhere, but as you can see, we can facilitate online training. So if you have another group that is interested, please feel free to reach out to me. We are always accepting donations, of course. If you're interested in volunteering, although we can't physically volunteer right now, if you're interested, we can at least talk to you about what your volunteer interest is, what programs you can get involved with, so we can at least have these conversations so that once social distancing is over and we can go outside and engage with the community again, you can hit the ground running. Also, so we didn't talk about labor traffic or fair trade, slave labor very much in this presentation. However, if you don't know where your products were made, then it is a good chance they were made with slave labor. So if you go to fairtradecertified.org, you can actually look up different brands that are fair trade certified. So especially as we have more time to shop online, that also means that we have more time to vet the products that we buy and make sure that we are using our dollars wisely so that we can contribute to people living a fair and equitable life as opposed to contributing to labor trafficking. And we at United Against Human Trafficking are currently launching new initiatives in fair trade. So if you're interested in things like shopping guide or local brands that fight human trafficking, items that are made by survivors, please feel free to give me an email at any time and I will connect you with those resources. So I'm going to leave you with our contact information. I believe when you registered for this webinar, you got an automatic email from me. My email is sbrewer, B-R-E-U-E-R @uaht.org. And please do feel free to follow us on social media. Okay, so that concludes our presentation, and I'm going to take a look and see if we have any questions. Okay. In my work, how often do I find that victims of human trafficking self-identify as a victim and seek help? Lori, thank you so much for posing this question. This is a huge issue because people do not normally identify as victims and they do not normally seek help. Like I mentioned in the beginning with the fraud and coercion, it really causes people to think that it's the decisions that they made that caused them to be in this situation. They really don't identify with terms like victim, exploitation, or trafficking. In fact, I was giving a presentation and talking about the various ways that people can be trafficked. And I had somebody raised their hand and mentioned that they had been labor trafficked in a traveling sales crew, and they didn't even realize that that was human trafficking until they listened to this presentation. So although we're discussing this information about human trafficking, what it is, what it looks like, how people are affected, people who are in these situations usually do not identify as victims, and they may not seek help. Another thing that we see is that there's sort of an ebb and flow to a trafficking situation. So there are some times during the situations where maybe the trafficker is providing them with gifts, or it's not, or making them feel loved, and it's not all bad. And then there are other times that the trafficker is, beating them, or they had to work 20 hours and they were starving, and there was this other situation. So what we've heard survivors say is that there were certain points during their exploitation that if somebody had offered help, they would have taken it. So if we have an opportunity to talk with a survivor over different points, we might find that one day they don't want any help. But if we were to talk to them on a different day, then they are ready to leave that situation and ready to get help. So as somebody who is concerned, and maybe as a social service provider, it's just important to sort of stay open and keep letting them know that there is a way for them to leave that situation, and there are resources waiting for them whenever they are ready to take advantage of them. Okay, there were more questions and I just didn't see them. Okay. Hi, Maggie. Okay. Are you working with professional trade groups to educate the masses? For example, the American Massage Therapy Association is one such professional organization for the massage therapists. AMTA also offers training classes for continuing education credits. Incorporating more sex trafficking training as continuing education credits for massage therapists would be a great way to ensure that they are educated in this issue. So at this time, we do not have a training specifically for massage therapists, but I do think that you're right. Human trafficking can really be rampant in the massage therapy community. And I definitely think that this is something that we can move into. So if you want, please send me an email and I can connect you with other resources that I know of for people who are specifically in that industry. And it's definitely something that I can bring up with my organization as far as something that we can address in the future. Okay. In Texas, there are breakdown in number of rescues by age, undocumented versus undocumented. Okay, so this is another really great question. And thank you guys so much for submitting a lot of questions. I really appreciate it. So this is a really difficult number to come by, and I will tell you why. There are a lot of different agencies that that assist survivors of human trafficking. There are agencies that work with foreign national victims specifically, or minors. And there is not really a way for people to amalgamate that data so it's all in one place. It's really individual studies that sort of reach out to all of these different organizations and try to come up with these numbers. As far as a breakdown, I do have some studies that can provide some guidance on that. So if you're interested in reading that studies, Belinda, please send me an email and I will share that with you. But the short answer is that it's really hard to find that solid data, but we do have some estimates. Okay, next question. In regards to the fraud you mentioned, is your group informing youth on what is acceptable or legal information to provide when applying for a job? She recently responded to a job ad on Facebook and left and the group messaged me asking age, gender, and race, which are not appropriate. She reported the group but sees similar ads. Yes, so we do educate young people about human trafficking and about recruitment methods. And I see that we are just about out of time and a lot of people are dropping out. So I'm gonna, oh, and that was the last question. Okay, so perfect, and we are right on time. It is just about 6 o'clock. So I want to thank everybody for staying for the length of this presentation. And if you have any additional questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. And again, I thank you for your time and your patience, and please enjoy the rest of your day.